And please welcome Mayor Denise Simmons, the mayor of Cambridge, who's going to give us welcome from the people of Cambridge.
Good morning. Oh, this is a very lively group. I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Saturday, 9 o'clock. All right. So my name is Denise Simmons, and I am the mayor of one incredible city. And I want to invite those of you that live here, welcome, and those of you that may be visiting from other city, town, or state, thank you for coming to Cambridge. Don't make it your last time here, because we're that little city that does a lot of good. And what we're here today, what we're going to witness, what we're going to participate in today, is a part of doing some good. So we gathered here at MIT to launch a day-long event that's asking us to focus on what kind of future do we want to have? What kind of world do we want to leave for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren? Ultimately, we're focusing today's program on the very survival of humanity. The very survival of humanity as we know it. So it's nothing too important. I say that with tongue firmly in cheek, because nothing can be more important than taking the steps to ensure humanity. Our ability to survive, to thrive, decades and centuries to come. Just recently, we celebrated the 100th anniversary or the 150th anniversary, it depends on how you count with MIT, of their presence in our state and in our city. And when you think back and look forward, and then you think in this context, you begin to worry just a bit that will MIT be here in another 50, 100, 150 years? So in order to have this discussion around our humanity and our longevity, if you will, I think it's important for us to recognize that there are, of course, some variables that are out of our control. We have no influence over earthquakes, or where a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado might strike or may sweep across a community, or when an illness or epidemic may rise up and, say, claim thousands. We can though try to mitigate these events, certainly, but we do not have a say in when they're going to descend upon us. On the other hand, there most definitely are some things that we do have control over. Perhaps the most important of these things is the kind of weapons that are allowed to be created to use against one another. Centuries ago, those who waged war and built armies had to take the fight to the enemy. One needed to actually be on the battlefield in order to have a direct impact, injure, or kill. But as time progressed, technology advanced, and we became quite adept at inventing ways to expand the scope of war. With each new generation, we became proficient in creating newer and deadlier weapons. And I don't know about you, but that really, really worries me. When I look at the debates, it really, really worries me too. But that's a whole nother discussion. In 2016, we had progressed to the point where, without ever having to step foot on a traditional battlefield, the heads of states of numbers of nations had the capability of launching weapons that could literally wipe out swaths of humanity, millions of lives, anywhere on the globe can be lost in a matter of seconds. That is just a very scary thought, isn't it? Isn't it? It is. And as we have good reason to be afraid, If Nation A has the power to completely obliterate Nation B, then Nation B just may feel compelled to create its own stockpile of weapons that can either obliterate Nation A just to act as a deterrent, but then Nation C and Nation D become concerned that they may be more vulnerable if they don't create their own weapons. And over time, this leads to dozens of nations, each with the power to completely obliterate its neighbors, which leads to a whole level, or higher level of anxiety, suspicion, and I have to tell you, prayers at night that these weapons will not ultimately be used. So what's the good news? The good news is that the ending of that story has yet to be written. Just because we have nuclear weapons doesn't mean we must use nuclear weapons. And over the past decades, the nations with the largest stockpiles of nuclear weaponry have actually laid the groundwork for trying to decrease the likelihood of these getting used on one another. We know that there's an appetite for these types of treaties and for our international leaders to work together to decrease the nuclear stockpiles and to open the lines of communication that would hopefully diffuse tensions before resorting to taking action that could have a nightmarish effect and consequences on our planet. But this is what's important. The leaders of nations across the planet need to continually be pushed to keep the conversation going forward. And that push comes from all of us. Activities like what we're gathered here to do today, from countries and communities all over the world. And that push must come from local government that sends clear messages that we will not be complicit in feeding the problem by either investing in destructive technologies or in companies that design and create these weapons. And I have to say I'm proud to live in this very little city that I feel has a very great impact. I know that the council has been proactive in that regard, and I'm also mindful of something we all should be mindful of, that Cambridge isn't going to save the world, that the city council and Mass Peace Action and folks like here at MIT, all of us together, can't save the world by ourselves. We can, though. We can sound the alarm. We can make gestures and provide templates for others to follow. But it's going to take a prolonged, sustained action from people in this community and all across the community, particularly those in those communities where military weaponry is closely tied to the local economy, to make their voices heard loud and clear. So the message is we have to look around here in this room ourselves and say, how can I be a stronger, better ambassador for peace? But we also have to ask ourselves, who's not in this room? And how do we make them ambassadors for peace? Each of us needs to take on the charge to bring other people into this conversation and embolden them to take action. Because it's not going to, if you think of every action as a single drop, all together we can make a mighty waterfall. It's important to understand, again, that it's going to be that prolonged, sustained action from people, from all of us across the community, to say one thing very loud and very clear, and that is, not in our name. We need people. We have to rise up and demand that our money, our intellectual capital, are not invested or used to contribute to nuclear proliferation, and Cambridge can lead the way. But it takes a global village to follow in our footsteps, to make it feel real and make the results lasting. The people behind today's event, my good friend Professor King, that I have to tell you, he is a very proactive, very progressive, and a nudge. I won't tell you how many phone calls, and now you're going to be there, and this is what you're going to do, and this is how, you know. You can't find anyone more committed to Jonathan, but he owes me big for today. But I have to say, I say that in joking, but I'm not more proud or more pleased to be here, to be a part of this work. The people behind today's event are going to share with you today their ideas for just what that template looks like. I want to thank each of you, all of you, for taking your time out of today's schedule to listen to what we have to say, what is said, but most importantly, I want to leave you with what I think is what joining together will do. We can, Cambridge can, we can all make a difference. We must make a difference. We can be the match that sparks the revolution for future generations so that they will live safer, more secure because of it. So again, thank you, each of you, for coming. Thank you for the work that you're about to do, and thank you for the work that you continue to do.
Thank you so much. On behalf of MIT, we're happy to have here a distinguished planetary scientist and Vice President for Research, Professor Maria Zuber.
Great. Okay, thank you, John. Let's see, I'll just talk like this. Mayor, first of all, thank you for those inspirational words. Thank you for your support of MIT, and thank you for your leadership in Cambridge on this and many, many other issues. All the rest of you, welcome to MIT. We're happy to have you here. We're thrilled to have you here, in fact. In Command and Control, the chilling reconstruction of the history of the nuclear era, Eric Schlosser summarizes the decades-long debate of historians who questioned whether the use of atomic bombs was needed to end the Second World War. The U.S. feared massive American casualties in a Japan invasion. But Japan was already devastated militarily, and blockades of the country's ports crippled the country's economic function. Other historians argued that the declaration of war on Japan by the Soviet Union would ultimately have had a greater effect than detonation of atomic weapons. Or, failing that, surely one atomic bomb would have adequately made the point of U.S. superiority. Compelling as these arguments are, we really don't know how history would have played out in a different World War II endgame. The Soviet declaration of war occurred 2 days after the Hiroshima cataclysm, and Nagasaki was bombed the next day. The day after that, Minister of War Korochika Anami urged the Japanese people to fight on. Quote, even though we have to eat grass and chew dirt and lay in the field. 4 days later, Emperor Hirohito overruled the military and submitted to unconditional surrender. For whatever ambiguity existed regarding the original decision to drop those devastating bombs, the nuclear proliferation in yield and numbers of devices during the subsequent Cold War leaves no such uncertainty of the absolutely unacceptable human risks. Thousands of bombs were built, and personnel were not adequately trained to handle them safely or securely. Courtesy of the Freedom of Information Act, knowledge has come into our keeping of nuclear weapons involved in plane crashes, falling from planes into residential areas, catching on fire, incorrectly wired, and armed by mistake or by power surges. There was epic infighting between the military service branches over the control of the nuclear arsenal, and documented evidence of multiple services targeting the same sites. There were Strangelovian rogue officers and idle threats of destruction of cities. I applaud Jonathan King and the other organizers of this conference and all of you in attendance for bringing the danger of nuclear war front and center so that these stories can be told and strategies devised to help assure that we avoid mistakes of the past. As noted in the workshop announcement, it's quite appropriate that we hold this conference here at MIT, which has a rich history and ongoing interest in the study of nuclear disarmament. Let's also keep in mind that MIT is home to an extensive program on nuclear security, and that investigators on both sides of the US-Iran nuclear agreement have MIT ties. And that using our reactor on campus in concert with numerical simulation, we have faculty and research staff who are designing more safe and more efficient nuclear reactors, and who are developing plans for siting reactors on offshore platforms. And that we have alumni who are designing tabletop reactors as a source of clean energy. And that some of our prestigious climate scientists and their colleagues at other institutions are calling for increased use of nuclear energy, saying it is essential in order to mitigate the most devastating consequences of global warming. I hope that this matter in particular is discussed in today's breakout session on climate change. In short, the moral issues that we face are abundant, and the critical objective of reducing the risk of nuclear war Okay, she's okay? Okay. Okay.
Those shoes will do it to you every time.
The moral issues that we face are abundant, and the critical objective of reducing the risk of nuclear war cannot be solved in isolation of the complex web of other equally alarming worldwide socio-political, economic, and environmental problems. The way to proceed is to put the plethora of these difficult problems on the table, to listen to all points of view, and to brainstorm practical solutions. Thank you again for being here, and on behalf of MIT, I wish you all a productive day.
Thank you so much, Professor Zuber, Mayor Simmons. Good morning, everybody. Last year was the 70th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was also the 5-year review conference of the signatory nations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This treaty, signed in 1970 by the great majority of the world's nations, was a leap forward in efforts to control nuclear weapons and move toward disarmament. Article 6 states that the nations holding nuclear weapons, including the United States, Russia, France, Britain, China, will proceed with dispatch toward getting rid of them. That was signed in 1970. Though the signatories who didn't have nuclear weapons, most of them have kept their promise and not developed nuclear weapons. Those countries that had nuclear weapons haven't made very much progress, as you can see. Leading into the United Nations conference, non-governmental peace organizations from around the world gathered in New York at Cooper Union for International Peace and Planet Conference. The lead organizer, Joe Gerson, is one of the organizers of this event and will be speaking later, to try to nudge the official delegations forward. Unfortunately, there was not great progress. It was very, very disappointing. Anyway, a number of us gathered there in New York realized we need to rebuild in the U.S. a kind of grassroots motion calling for nuclear disarmament. Many in this room are too young to remember the nuclear weapons freeze campaign, but in the early 1980s, it brought 1 million people to Central Park, and that drove President Reagan to actually negotiate with the Soviet Union and get the first significant treaty reductions. Now, in thinking about where it could be, Cambridge and MIT was a natural. As Professor Zuber mentioned, we have a long tradition. After the Manhattan Project, many of the physicists dispersed. One group came to MIT, and they were among the ones who thought it was a mistake to continue to develop nuclear weapons, and they moved into opposition. Philip Morrison, many of you read his column in Scientific American for many, many years. Vicky Weisskopf, Henry Kendall, who founded the Union of Concerned Scientists, Herman Feshbach. Randy Forsberg wasn't actually a physicist, but she hung with the physicists. Bernard Feld, who was the editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. Kostas Tsipras, Aaron Bernstein, who's still with us, and will be speaking today. George Rasmussen, who was a key proponent of an architect of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I haven't mentioned the current group, which Maria mentioned, for example, Ernie Moniz, our former physics faculty, who was a key person in the Iran negotiations. Now, it wasn't only physicists. Other scientists have played a role, biological scientists. I think we were inspired most initially by Linus Pauling, great chemist and biochemist, who led the first major nuclear disarmament effort in the United States to ban atmospheric testing. And my colleagues in biology, Salvador Luria, Ethan Signa, David Baltimore, Chomsky in linguistics, George Wald and Ruth Hubbard up the street, were leaders in the opposition to the Vietnam War. Hirschbach, Messelson, myself, and others worked on strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention. So there's a long, long tradition here. And we are gathered here. Our organizing committee, they're dispersed, so maybe I'll just ask him to stand. Max Tegmark, Elaine Scarry, Joe, why don't you stand up? Cole. So if there's any problem, Gary Goldstein, if there's any problem, look carefully at these people. Right. Now, we wouldn't have been able to do this. Special thanks are due to two people who are not here, Patricia Weinman and Christina English. They're the staff of MIT Radius, the former Technology and Culture Forum, deals with these broad issues, supported by the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Mass Peace Action, the inheritor of the Nuclear Freeze campaign, and SANE, and Cole Harrison is his executive director. Max Tegmark, when he's not a professor of physics teaching 800 students in 801, is also the president of the Future of Life Institute. They've been key in making this come forward, and of course, we've had the support from the city and from the administration. Our organizers have agreed. There's one thing we did agree on. The president is the commander-in-chief. He came to office talking about the importance of nuclear disarmament. He's actually reappeared in the last couple of days talking about this. We have a petition. Everybody has it in your packet. We hope many of you will sign that petition. If you do sign it, we'll send you an email later on with an electronic link to send to your friends, your kids, your colleagues. And we're going to try to launch across the country a call to President Obama to carry out what he's, to make the world free of nuclear weapons. Many people think that he is actually very concerned about what his legacy will be, and that he actually might be responsive to that. Okay, at that, we're ready for our first panel. Ira, if you would come up here. And thanks again to our